Now, of course, Highland regiments in the British Army are such a well-recognised phenomenon within Scotland and Britain, indeed across the world, obviously, that it's easy to forget that the creation and early origins actually happened in a really quite short and distinct period of time. Basically, the first regiment is created, as I don't need to tell this audience, in 1739, and the last regiment is created in 1799. In other words, although they've got long histories after the fact, they're actually quite a short moment in time in terms of when the British state decided to create them and then to cease creating them. Basically a mere 60 years between the creation or the formulation of the watch companies into a regular regiment here in Perthshire in 1739 and the formation of the last Highland regiment to join the British Army, the 93rd, in 1799/1800, the Southern Highlanders. In other words, although Highland regiments now have a very long history, in order to understand their origins, you only really need to look at general conditions in the period between roughly 1739 and 99 to get a sense of at least some of the basic answers to what was the nature of the early regiments, what motivated the soldiers and the officers into them, etc. In other words, what are the general political, economic, social and cultural conditions in the Highlands, in Scotland, in Britain and across an empire in this particular period? Well, the Highlands themselves are probably best characterised in this period with the first decade representing a period of intense political and economic, political and military instability. There's the threatened Jacobite rising in 44, the actual rising in 45, suppression in 46, the government's clamped down on the Highlands thereafter. And that sort of first decade from sort of the 40s into the early 50s. In a sense, after the 50s, politically and militarily the Highlands calmed down, at least in comparison to the turmoil of the early period. But what emerges instead over the next 5 decades up to 1800 and beyond is growing political, growing economic and social dislocation. The Highlands are increasingly integrated into the British economy, and that facilitates the increasing and eventual dissolution of clanship as a meaningful form of social organisation. Society changes very rapidly, not so much because of Culloden and the end of the Jacobites, but really as an intensification of economic processes. Landlords increase rents very, very quickly. Rents have been climbing in the Highlands faster than anywhere else in Britain and Ireland. They go up between roughly 200 and 300% in the period when the regiments are being created. Landlords are beginning, of course, to reorder their estates more intensively. Old farming townships and methods are breaking up rapidly. For some this means eviction, for others it means transportation within and across estates, for some it means transatlantic emigration, and overall it means a heightened sense of insecurity and increasing lack of access or secure access to land. One of the key understanding background factors to remember for the history of the early phase of the Highland regiments is that it occurs, or they occur, at exactly the same moment as the early phases of the Highland clearances. The Highland, what we call first phase of clearance, is generally stipulated by historians to start in roughly the 1740s and be roughly ended by the 1820s. So there's an absolute parallel between the era of first phase clearance, as it's now called, and the creation of Highland regiments. In other words, clearance and regiments are emerging together and probably shaping the nature of each other. Now, if changing conditions in the Highlands are one factor, the big international or national situation is altogether different. It's fairly safe to say that the 18th century, between 1700 and 1800, was remarkably warlike. Britain enters into a phase of war, a series of wars that it's never experienced before or after. There will of course be worse wars, but the sequence of wars is really quite remarkable. And within that century, the last two-thirds, this period from the 40s up to the end of the century itself, was even more prominent for the frequency of large-scale, genuinely global wars. Britain's at war for 31 out of those 60 years, including big, genuine, global conflicts fought in theatres and oceans all over the world. The 7 Years' War, what the Americans would call the French and Indian War, fought from 1756 to 63 or 1754 before if you happen to be in America. The American Revolutionary War, a rather unfortunate punch-up between Britain and its American colonists between 1775 and 83, and then the really big French Revolutionary War, 1793 to 1801. These conflicts, that generate the creation of the regiments, of course. But the total of 31 years out of 60, when Britain's officially in international war, doesn't include a whole range of other smaller conflicts which nobody really knows about today. Any number of wars, often fairly brutal in nature, being fought particularly in India, some in the Caribbean, against slave uprisings. Basically means there's very rarely more than 4 or 5 years when Britain isn't engaged in some major conflict, either very large or in theatre terms. You can see that, in a sense, in, and I hope this, maybe not, that was going so well, I'll just change it this way. I hope these dots don't come out very well, but let me just give you a sense of the theatre deployments of the Black Watch itself and this important, relatively short-lived 2nd Battalion, as it were, created in 1779 and 80. The area in yellow, you can see, is obviously its early deployment, created in Scotland. It moved to Flanders in 1744-45, comes back, but isn't deployed into Scotland in 1745-46. So that's the sort of yellow area where you can see the regiment, once it's created, moving to international theatres. The ones you see in red are the 7-year war deployments, mostly in North America, around the New York, Albany, Quebec area, later on further south into Pennsylvania and the western frontier for the war against the Indians, but also with an interlude in the early 60s to fight in the West Indies and the capture of Havana from the Spanish. The blue deployment basically encapsulates the general area of theatre where it fought against the Americans during the French Revolutionary War. Less in far north, more around New York, the Howe campaigns of the 1777-78, further south during the capture of Charleston in the later 1770s. However, in 1779, the Crown creates the second, what will be a 2nd Battalion of the Black Watch, very quickly later to become the 73rd Regiment, and it is deployed out to India. So in fact the Black Watch is fighting in 2 theatres across the globe by the 1770s. The black deployments represent where the regiment is deployed during the French Revolutionary War. The key point is these sort of deployments would not be unusual in today's global world. The point is the regiment is literally very rapidly having a global history, fighting really whatever Britain's imperial requirements demanded. Britain by this period is becoming one of really 3 or 4 world powers, but she's crippled with one major problem in this period. She has a very, very small population. Britain, compared to the other great powers of France and Spain, has a remarkably small population, probably only about 8 million. At this period, that's well under half that of Spain itself, never mind Spain's large populations in Latin America, and it's under a third of that of France. So Britain's trying to punch its weight with not a lot of manpower, effectively. Add to that the fact that Britain recruits and prioritises recruitment of the Navy, for obvious reasons, and you can understand why the Army was always going to struggle to acquire men. And Britain is very imaginative when it comes to acquiring its military manpower. They hire thousands, literally thousands of particularly Hanoverian and Hessians from middle German kingdoms. George, the royal family, are of course a German royal family, so they can also hire their own subjects, Hanoverians. Over 16,000 Hessians and Hanoverians served alongside the Black Watch, in this case, against the Americans in the middle of the 1770s. Meanwhile, the British state is constantly creating new military units, experimenting all over the world with trying to get enough manpower to look after its interests. It creates German-speaking militias in Pennsylvania from Protestant settlers who settled there in the 1770s. French-Canadian units, again a war against the Americans. They even hire Swiss Protestants from right in the middle of Switzerland and deploy them in India all the way through the 1740s, the 1750s to 1770s. They hire Tamils in the south, they hire Urdu-speaking levels in India. In other words, Britain is just a huge employer of cosmopolitan manpower. And in that sense, that's probably where you should locate its decision to create distinctively Highland regiments. It's just part of a wider urgent drive to acquire manpower in any number of different ways. But a key thing about those military units was that they were very short-lived. Britain can't afford to retain these vast number of units, so whenever the war ends, Britain broke those units up. All sorts of units live for only as long as the war lasts, then they're rapidly broken up. Now, the reason for that is cultural, as well as practical and financial. Not only is the cost too much, obviously, but Britain as a society tended to be actually fairly anti-army. It associated large, particularly peacetime armies, with the sort of thing the French and the Spanish do. It's not British to retain a large, peacetime army. And if you're going to do it, you're best keeping it out of sight and out of mind in Ireland. The Navy was seen as culturally acceptable. It protected British liberties. An army had the whiff of authoritarianism about it, and therefore, culturally, British taxpayers didn't want to see large standing armies. So the minute a peace arrived, huge numbers of regiments would be broken or demobilised, to use the term. The result is a seesawing effect. You get Britain raising large numbers of regiments and then breaking large numbers of regiments on a fairly regular basis throughout the second half of the 18th century. The big periods of demobilisation, 1748, 1763 and 1783, so at the end of those big wars I was talking about, Britain begins to break up in large numbers of regiments. Now, this has important implications for the way we should think about Highland regiments. Of course, there's a well-known number of them now. The Black Watch itself, obviously, the Gordons, the Campbells, the Seaforths and the Sullivans. But they are a very, very small remnant of a huge slew of regiments, Highland regiments, created throughout the 18th century. The ones that still exist today in one form or another are just the tip of a much, much bigger iceberg, containing many, many more men you would expect, and yet, in a sense, bright comets, only flashing and existing for a short period of time, and then being broken up. In this context, one of the ways to think of the Black Watch is not so much the way we tend to think about it, that is that its uniqueness lies in the fact it was the first Highland regiment. I would argue its uniqueness lies not so much in it being first, but in the fact that it survives the big breaking up of regiments in 1748, particularly when George II was not keen on many Highlanders at all, of any description, for fairly obvious reasons. Equally not surprising, it's surprising it survived against the really big demobilisations of the 1760s. So its claim to fame is not just the first, but actually the fact that it is sufficiently prominent enough that no one will touch it or break it when the mobilisations come along in the 60s and the 40s. And the reason for that is probably, one, because it's quite far down the line. It's in the 40s, so it's quite safe in terms of its numeric placing within the British Army's line of battle, but it also garners a reputation, a very, very prominent and impressive reputation very, very quickly, and that almost certainly saves it. And to put that in some sort of context, there were many other Highland regiments that in their day had superb operational histories. They were lauded as fantastic regiments. Fraser's 78th Highlanders were fought at the heights of Abraham in Quebec, was considered a superb unit. Lord Macdonald's 76th Highlanders were regiments that we don't really know about today, fought with Cornwallis all during the Southern Campaign, where the British only lost one battle, but it happened to be Yorktown. It was a bit of a disaster. But until that point, Macdonald's regiment was considered by Cornwallis one of the best he had, and it had a superb track record. All those regiments were demobilised in turn. In other words, one of the things to bear in mind when we're thinking about what motivates and how do Highland soldiers identify themselves is to remember this pattern of mobilisation and demobilisation. It's actually the experience of most Highland soldiers that they will be in a unit that is not expected to last particularly long. It will last for as long as the crown requires it for the war in question. In other words, many soldiers, not just Highland, but generally across the whole of the British world, are entering at least some regiments with the expectation that it's only going to last as long as the war lasts. And there was a fairly regular pattern. Most political economists and financiers worked out that most big European powers couldn't fight a war for longer than 6 or 7 years before financial exhaustion set in, and we were forced to basically stop. Didn't matter who was winning, who was losing, basically grind to a halt because the state couldn't keep it going. And actually, that's pretty much a remarkable, consistent figure. It can be France, can continue fighting, she's actually winning quite well by the Austrian War, but simply runs out of money. Britain, interestingly, even after the loss at Yorktown, actually begins to win again in 1782, towards the end of the American War, but simply begins to run out of money, or at least cheap money, to fight the war. So there's an expectation that wars will last 6, probably no more than 9 years. And it's in that expectation that the men often join regiments. And in fact, for the whole period when Highland regiments are created, that's pretty much how long the wars last. They're big wars, continental wars, but often only lasting a certain particular limited amount of time. The result is that by 1783, there are still only 3 Highland regiments that have actually survived the making and breaking of these lots of different units. The 42nd, obviously, as it now is, the 72nd and the 73rd. And the only reason the 73rd surviving is because there's still an ongoing war in India. Now that had important implications for the purpose of the Black Watch and the type of soldier that was in it. Increasingly, as the decades passed and regiments came and went, the Black Watch was increasingly seen as the reservoir of expertise and professionalism that would then enable the creation of new Highland regiments as they came along. So it's essentially not just the oldest Highland regiment, but in many respects it's the nursery from which will spring some of the officers and certainly lots of the NCOs that will rapidly create new Highland regiments whenever the state requires them. Let me give you an example of that with this man here. Now that man is Major Dr McPherson. He was not a Black Watch officer, but he and several other Black Watch, half-pay Black Watch officers are mobilised to construct very rapidly the 71st Fraser Highland Regiment, which will actually be 2 battalions at the beginning of the war against the Americans. It's busily being mobilised at the end of 1775, and McPherson is busy recruiting manpower and getting them organised. The key things he complains about right through the end of 75 into the spring of 1776 is he does not have enough corporals and sergeants to basically train all this green manpower that he has milling about Glasgow and Stirling. The result is that McPherson, on the advice of some other half-pay officers recommissioned and who'd been in the Black Watch, was to call for a slew of Black Watch corporals and sergeants to be moved out, much against their will, it has to be said, and to form the NCO Corps of the 71st Highland Regiment. And that's fairly typical, and Black Watch plays that role all the way through the later demobilisations, even into the 1790s. Now, in a sense, this also makes the Black Watch atypical. It's not, in many respects, a typical Highland regiment. It is, in many respects, understood as, until after at least the War of the Americans, the only obviously permanent Highland regiment. And that has implications for who will join it, and for indeed those that will not. It seemed to set the precedent and model for how you would expect Highland regiments to be raised, or what sort of formation it ought to do, even what sort of activities operationally it would undertake. And culturally, in terms of how Highland regiments are understood by the British population, it provides the model for all the others. All other Highland units act in the shadow of the Black Watch, and they've got to try and match some of the superlative reputations that develop very, very rapidly. And that's sometimes difficult for them to do. Now, what's really typically British, in the sense of the Black Watch's early actions, is they often come out of defeat spectacularly well. Brilliantly British to be able to turn a good military thumping into a good thing. Fontenoy, obviously, in May 1745, is a very, very heavy a strategic military defeat for Britain and the Austrians for that matter. Bad battle, badly lost, very heavy, and strategically gives most of the Low Countries to the French. Similarly, Ticonderoga in New York Province, famous to anybody that knows anything about the regiment, is a big military defeat, at least in obvious tactical terms. Yet the regiment springs back from these with its reputation hugely enhanced as a result of its actions. In fact, the action at Ticonderoga, well, the battles actually fought between the actions had fought over the 6th through the 7th, 8th, and up to a point the 9th, but the actual action, major action takes place on the 8th before they leave on the 9th. And it was, for the Black Watch, a fairly appalling affair. That's the Americans reconstructed Fort Ticonderoga earlier this century, but that gives you a good idea of the sort of geography. And on the 8th of July, the Black Watch and a number of other regiments launched an attack on the big bastions on the other side of that fort. And the result was terrible. 27%, it is reckoned, of the regiment were killed, not just wounded but killed. 8 of its 30-odd officers, 9 NCOs, and never very sure, it's put at somewhere between 260 and 299 men are killed. It's roughly 27% of a very large regiment at the time. It's effectively decimated, and but the cultural effects are that it cements its reputation, which has been building upon since Fontenoy. The king, at that point, adds the prefix royal, which distinguishes it thereafter from any other Highland regiment, and more importantly, cements the War Office decision to commit to having a second battalion, which was made up really of additional companies that would be raised in Scotland at the time. And creating a second battalion meant almost certain the Black Watch would survive any demobilisations after 63, effectively secured permanently, if nothing else. Similarly, the individual case of this man, it's not often you saw the London press producing a pamphlet called the Highland Hero in 1745. That was highly unusual. They were calling them something else usually, but 1745. However, again, Fontenoy wasn't just good for the regiment, it helped begin to create a cultural image of what the Highland soldier ought to be and ought to do. Famous case of James Campbell, who's a private in what was then the 43rd, it's renumbered in 1749 to the 42nd. At Fontenoy is believed to have killed up to 7 to 9 Frenchmen before, unfortunately, Campbell moves his ability to do so. He apparently couldn't fight with his right hand, it appears. Very famous cause célèbre. And above all, sort of rammed home, or began the process of ramming home, some of the cultural attributes that were associated with Highland soldier. Campbell, Ticonderoga, and any other number of actions created a general popular understanding of what a Highland soldier is and should be. They were seen as naturally aggressive. Now, natural in 18th century terminology meant they did not have to have it drilled into them, like Prussians or Austrians. In other words, they were instinctive soldiers rather than professional soldiers. The idea was that they were enthusiastic. They liked fighting because they were clansmen and presumably clans liked fighting. Now notice, this is what popular cultural and intellectual opinion is generating. These guys just like a good rally, basically. In fact, Adam Ferguson, major intellect of the Scottish Enlightenment and a former chaplain of the Black Watch, described the Highlanders, quote, as he saw it, natural genius for military activity. And the reason that Ferguson believed this was down to what he called, quote, their tribal system, end quote. In other words, intellectual and popular opinion is shaping the gear into a natural soldier. It's just something that they can do instinctively and naturally. They enjoy doing it, and they enjoy enlisting in Highland regiments. There's enthusiasm for all of this. They are particularly enthusiastic if the officer, as Campbell was, under officers that they know are from their own area and know their social status and treat them accordingly. So So a big image has been built up of what the Black Watch soldier is like, and indeed what therefore all other soldiers should be like. No one completed, this image builds up over the 18th century with the Black Watch and other regiments in turn. In a sense, it's not started by, but finished by this man, Major General David Stewart Garth, Persian obviously, and a Black Watch officer of considerable experience. He fights in some of the worst campaigns in terms of casualties of the French Revolutionary War. He had a close working knowledge of the Black Watch, and it had to be said of other Highland regiments. But his claim to fame in many ways is not so much his military career, which was like hundreds of other Highland officers. It's the fact that he decided to write a hugely popular book, sketches of the character, manners and present state of the Highlands of Scotland, with the details of the military services of the Highland regiments. In 2 volumes, published in 1822, the same year George IV turned up in his pink-coloured tights, bedecked in tartan in Edinburgh. Of the 2 events, this was by far and away, in a sense, the most enduring. Some really interesting work done on Garth points out that he and another Scottish officer from 2 centuries earlier, Colonel James Monroe, are essentially responsible for creating a new genre of literature in English, the regimental history. Regimental history is born in Scotland as a distinctive subgenre of literature. And of all the regiments, of course, that he figures in this hugely popular work, popular all over the English-speaking world. Before he croaks in St. Helena, Napoleon's an avid reader. It's hugely popular in Germany. It's a best-selling book. What it does is cement the image of what Highland regiments should be. And he puts the Black Watch, understandably, as his own regiment front and centre. Garth wrote in a strikingly, almost subconsciously nostalgic way. He expressed regret for what he knew was the end of the society he was describing. By the 1820s, clearance is essentially, and social change has broken up the society that he's attempting to describe. But to his huge international readership, Stewart was confirming what Campbell's actions at Fontenoy and the Black Watch's experience at Ticonderoga had begun to tell everybody. The emphasis was on the Highlander as a natural soldier, a willing recruit, and that Highland regiments were essentially the state-sponsored institutionalisation, might even say preservation, of Highland clanship. That was the image that Garth had projected to his readership. Now, it's a measure of how widely accepted this image was that even Britain's enemies used the Highland regiments to denote the aggression of the British Army. This is American propaganda. No offence to American visitors listening. It's a pamphlet produced by the Patriots in relation to the British occupation of Boston in 1775, which actually passed off relatively bloodlessly, etc., etc., etc. But in trying to indicate what they saw as the overarching aggression and brutality of the British Army, they went and chose an image which would be immediately relevant to anybody within the British, at least the English-speaking British Empire. They chose to represent the Highland Regiment as the sort of unacceptably aggressive face of British power. Same is true of India. This is a very famous image, an Indian image from the 1780s. That's effectively an Indian equivalent of the Bayeux Tapestry. It's a long painting indicating a conflict fought in the south of India in the 1780s. Depicts the Battle of Polylar, now a largely unknown battle, and it's painted on the Dawabag Palace in Seringapatam. And what it shows is the destruction of a British army. This is a very famous image in 21st century India, liberation against the British, etc. Interestingly, all the officers are Scots, and the men about to die here are men of the 73rd Highland Regiment. So on both sides of the world, although they're not depicted as Highland, Highland regiments are at the forefront of the way even enemies project the nature of the British Army. In a sense, to sort of break for levity. One of the big objections I have to the American, the Mel Gibson extravaganza that is The Patriot, was that if he was going to choose to show some sort of psychopathic British officer, he ought not to have chosen a clip-cut English officer. He ought to have probably put somebody in a kilt and demonstrated, because that is what the Americans at the time perceived to be particularly British military aggression, as the image shows. Now, if there was a long-established understanding, now by the middle of the 19th century, 100-odd years old, of what motivated Highland soldiers, by roughly the 1840s, an alternative story began to emerge. Starting with Donald MacLeod's gloomy memories of 1841, followed up by Alexander Mackenzie's famous 1883 A History of the Highland Clearances, continued right up through John Preble's Mutiny, Highland Regiments in Revolt. A very different interpretation was suggested. Here the emphasis was not on the Highland soldier as a willing, enthusiastic recruit, but rather as the victim of intimidation and of indirect force, either by the landlord or by the state. In this scenario, the Highland soldier isn't a willing volunteer. He is effectively a conscript in all but name. Now, there's no doubt that if you actually look at the records from the period when the regiments are raised, that despite the army projecting itself as an exclusively volunteer force, it actually wasn't. There were conscripts in the British Army in the 18th century, however much people pretended that there weren't. And Highland populations, Highland communities are coming under distinct state and landlord pressure to cough men up, either voluntarily or coercively. In the case of the landlord, it's actually quite well understood how this system works. Basically, landlords will offer families land and land security in return for one of their sons, cousins, grandsons, or whatever. Anybody that didn't volunteer could leave themselves or their family susceptible to eviction. All the big landlords who raised Highland regiments in this period, the Argylls, the Athels, the Earls of Godalming, Sutherland, Seaforth, even smaller lairds like the MacLeods of Dunvegan or the MacDonalds of Skye, all use this method. When recruiting in the Sutherland estate for the last regiment, Highland regiment raised by the state, and when it ran into opposition, the factor made a very interesting statement. He drew up a list of Ascent and Lairg tenantry that, as he said, had opposed the recruiting of the regiment, wrote on September 1779 to the Countess saying, "Now you will judge accurately of the demerit of those tenants and of their eviction." Namely, that's it. You've opposed recruitment, you're out. Landlords were in a position to do that. But the point was not to evict, but to recruit. And landlords could and did recruit hundreds of their own tenantry fairly quickly and fairly cheaply. But it left them with a whole set of land obligations on their estates. They had to house families, it could break up the productivity of farms, and the landlords weren't necessarily particularly keen. Fear of landlord retribution, or alternatively, the more positive hope of material and social advancement, probably combined to help explain why thousands of Gaels are joining these Highland regiments. But the state also had conscription mechanisms that we know very little about and that operated with considerable effect in the 1750s and 1770s in particular. What were called rather incongruously impress acts or impressment acts. They didn't tend to impress the people that were on the receiving end of them. They are effectively conscription acts. People who were deemed to be underemployed or unemployed could be targeted for forcible conscription by local GPs. And interestingly, Scotland uses the Impress Acts much more effectively and much more systematically than either anywhere in Ireland, Wales or in England. There are very good reasons for that. Particularly in the 1750s, this is the first major war since Culloden. Scotland doesn't have a good reputation in London, it's considered quasi-treasonous, everybody's a crypto-Jacobite, so Scotland was out to demonstrate its loyalty to the British system. The result is the enforced application of the Impress Act all over Scotland. In fact, in 6 weeks, Scotland raised over 1,600 men, and they're all sent in to just ordinary line battalions, including hundreds of Gaels. So we also need to remember that in America, at Ticonderoga, you do not just have Gaels in kilts. In the 32nd Regiment, you have hundreds of men who are garment speakers, but they will be dressed in standard line uniform. They will just be conscripts. The point was the Impress Acts could be used for a carrot and stick. And let me just give you one example. And that is of Captain Aeneas Mackintosh, a Black Watch officer recruiting in Inverness and Lochaber in the spring of 1756. On the 23rd of April, Mackintosh wrote to his commanding officer, Major Duncan Campbell of Bordeaux, saying, quote, "I shall send all the good pressmen I can get from these regions, and you may pick and choose for the regiment," the Black Watch. "I have proclaimed at all the parish churches in Lochaber and in Badenoch that where there are such miscreants and idlers," it was always us, "that for a fortnight after the implementation of the Act, I will take and give any man 2 guineas and a crown if they come willingly. If I can keep them, if the Press Act continue along here, I will give you a regiment," meaning he's going to get lots of men. In fact, he got 92 men in 10 days, voluntarily, because they feared conscription. In other words, when you look at conditions in the Highlands, what you have are a range of motives. You have conscripts, often people from the lowest rungs of social background. Most of the people conscripted by Mackintosh were ordinary landless labourers, young, under 30. These men's motives didn't matter because they were conscripted. They had no choice. And it's important to bear in mind this coercion operating on the recruits. But the reality is that the majority weren't conscripts. The majority of people volunteered for regiments. Many certainly enlisted to avoid conscription, but most probably joined for a whole range of monetary, social and practical reasons. Money seems such an obvious point, but it's worth repeating because people like Garth and much of the propaganda downplayed money and just said the Gael did it because they wanted to. There were no monetary reasons involved, and that's highly unlikely, let's be honest. Fighting for the love of it is one thing, but the Highlands are a poor area and regular wages were a boon. Army wages weren't a lot, but the one thing they did were regular. You were assured income if you joined the army. That's why the region had been deploying its manpower into any number of different armies. The Dutch army in the 16th and 17th, the Swedish army in the 17th centuries as well. Soldiering, unlike in England and Wales, was actually considered a very honourable occupation. Cromwell rather admired the reputation of the army in England. It still has a very honourable reputation and profile across all classes in Scotland. In an age of increasing economic instability, rising rents, increasing bad access to land, the attractions of soldiering were obvious. And this impulse operated at all levels, from landlords down to the lowest recruits. And let me give you one example of that. That, by the way, is the famous picture from this museum of almost certainly, we're not entirely sure, but it's almost certainly the 2nd Battalion as formed in the aftermath of Ticonderoga, practicing on Glasgow Green before being deployed into the American theatre. It's a brilliant image. I've seen a lot of people use it very well, and it is one of the few images we have of like early Highland Regiment practicing as drill. What we do know from the letters of Aeneas Mackintosh is that some of these men will be conscripts, in the sense they would have been impressed by the Act with no choice, and others will be volunteers. So it's not one body of Highland soldiers, lots of different types of them. The key thing is, though, is that everybody could gain rapidly from joining the army. I'm only going to give you one example, and that's of Norman MacLeod of Beggin, painted there in his Highland, in his officers' covered regiments out in India. Typical Highland landlord. He's got a big estate, half of Skye, Glenelg, and some of the Outer Hebrides, and he's got a rent of £3,750. That's a lot, but he also has £51,000 worth of debt. he's skint. He's as skint as the lowest member of society in some ways. And he's about to lose his estates when the war against the Americans break out. He's a relation of Simon Fraser of Lovat. He gains a captaincy and hands over 75 men, and gains his commission with the 71st Fraser Highlanders. 2 years later, he hands in 100 men and is made major of the 73rd Highland Regiment, the one that is later in India. And in 1779, he adds another 100 and is made Lieutenant Colonel of that short-lived 2nd Battalion of the Black Watch, which is commissioned in 1779, sails to India, and will confusingly become the 73rd Regiment later on. Now, to put that into some sort of financial context, by 1774-75, he's Commander-in-Chief of His Majesty's Forces at Madras and has an annual income of £3,500, almost the same as his entire Highland rentals. And he owns a large part of the west of the Highlands. He takes his regiments on a series of devastating campaigns in the central of India, and in a couple of months in 1789 makes £100,000 for prize money. Interestingly, he arrives back shortly afterwards, and the MacLeod estates are still in MacLeod hands. In other words, for the elite that can acquire the manpower, the army is a hugely lucrative affair. MacLeod uses his estate tenantry as a cash crop. He gives them to the army, and in return gains the commission. That's what's in it for the elite. What about the ordinary soldiers? What do they get? Well, they get a bounty. In 1750, if you joined the army voluntarily, you got £3. That's quite a substantial amount of money, particularly if you're a landless labourer. By the time of the war against the Americans, it's up at well over £10. And by the 1790s, it's £30. That's about twice the entire annual wage of an agricultural labourer. So there are big reasons to join the army voluntarily. All the evidence shows that ordinary Highland soldiers were astute and highly effective at bargaining with their officers. They would haggle over any number of different things. They're not passive victims sitting there waiting to either be enthusiastically join or to be conscripted. All the evidence we know of Highland soldiers is that they haggle well for what they go for. There's two extremes. You can either have the enthusiastic David Garth image, Highlanders just loyally and unquestionably following their landlords, or they're passive victims. The reality, of course, they were neither of those things. They would negotiate and arbitrate, often drive very hard bargains with their officers. MacLeod of Slate MacDonald of Slate despaired in 1778 when he noted, when trying to recruit his men in Skye, quote, "There are thousands of stipulations which I must agree to as to what these men will get on the occasion of their return. It is always lands we get when we return, and in the interim I must accommodate their interminably abominable mothers and fathers." So he's sort of sitting there with his tenantry basically haggling for what they will do. Getting conscious at times of it. Access to secure land in the era of first phase clearance was a key way in which thousands of ordinary Gaels would join the Highland regiments, as MacDonald's quote makes clear. The soldiers also anticipated intelligently that if they joined the regiment, they were not joining for life or for 25 years. They would be in for 7 to 9. End of war, regiment breaks, off they come. The point is the Black Watch makes us think of permanent regiments, regiments constantly standing with constantly professional manpower. The reality was most regiments had a short shelf life, and Gaels went into them on that basis for a number of reasons. Basically, thousands of Highland soldiers saw soldiering not the way we see it now, but rather as an extended secondment from civilian life, by which they could gain salary and probably security at the end of it. A full 25 years service in the Black Watch would be the norm for soldiers joining that regiment, but it was atypical for the bulk of Gaels and ordinary Highland soldiers that joined the majority of the regiments. For those who didn't join the 42nd, but rather the short-lived versions, army service offered a channel, a very practical one, towards real material security and better access to land and enhanced social status. And I'm going to finish very briefly by just giving you some examples of this. That's the very hardly now known little settlement that's now actually come on farm called Strain. It's in Campbell. In 1763, when it's upheld by the commissioners of the annexed estates, actually a place where they settled Black Watch soldiers coming out of the 2nd Battalion in addition of companies. 26 men given 50 acres for 10 years on a relatively short rent. There's Arabian Sky. It might be difficult to make out, but you can probably just make out the small croft systems. These were founded in 1783 when Lord MacDonald fulfilled his promises and gave land to men who had actually had to surrender at Yorktown, again for 10 years on short rents. Tiny little places not known about, but the point was that these were often the objectives of what the soldiers were looking for at the end of it. But the state also played a major role and often gave land out on a huge scale. Here's Crown Point in North America, in what was then the province of New York, strategic communication point between New York and the conquered province of Quebec. 1763, the Crown hands over thousands of acres to demobilised soldiers, very, very large numbers of whom were Black Watch. Major Alan Campbell of the 42nd gets 5,000 acres, not as a tenant. He owns the 5,000 acres. The Crown gives this land in ownership. That makes him, in Scottish terms, a major landlord. He has shot up the social scale. Ordinary soldiers would get 50 acres, but I have to mention the brilliantly named Sergeant Moses Campbell of the 42nd, 200 acres. Sergeant's got 200 owned. That makes him the equivalent of bonnet laird. In other words, the social increase is substantial. At the end of the American War, just to finalise, Highland soldiers in Ontario gained in 6 weeks almost 63,000 acres from just 2 regiments. Settling all along this area here around New Johnston Royalist settlements. 63,000 acres is a colossal amount of land given to people, remember, who are often landless labourers. The result is the army is massively increasing people's social upward mobility. In other words, Highland soldiers are playing the military and crown system brilliantly, and in many ways didn't really lose the war against the Americans. They ended up coming out particularly well on top, just not where they expected. They ended up further north and in slightly colder climates than they expected. Let me finish off with just one quote and then I'll wrap up because I'm conscious of running over time. I want to quote a letter from one of the few letters we have from an ordinary Highland soldier that survives without being rewritten or modified by an officer. It was written in August from New York in 1778 by a man we think was William Mackenzie from Netherland and Argyll, but we're not really sure. What we do know is he was a piper in Fraser's 71st Highlanders. He's writing back to his family in Argyll, and it survived because the minister of Glenorchy just kept the letter. Probably because he read it out in church, who knows. But what it does do is give a brilliant indication of the sort of regimental loyalties, loyalty to officers, and just the local nature of what the soldier was thinking, and above all, what motivated him. What it reveals is just how ordinary Highland soldiers were brilliantly at ease with negotiating the army and the opportunities afforded by the empire and by military service. What is revealed is a hugely confident, worldly wise Highland soldier who's far removed from either the unthinking enthusiast of Garth or the passive victim of clearance and landlords. This is what he writes, quote, "I am still in Captain Patrick Campbell of Glenuwer's company. I am piper to the 2nd Battalion of the 71st Regiment. I am as well and as hearty as I can be in my life. My pay is good as 1 in 6 per day, much better than hoeing cattle in Argyll. I hope within 2 years that my fortune will be good, as I will have 200 acres of free land and be a gentleman here. This is the best country in the world, war or not. We always get the better of our enemy. We have them retreating like here before a pack of hounds. If it were not for this damned war, this country is the best in the world. Remember me to William McFarlane in Glenorchy and tell him that his brother John is in good health in Captain Chisholm's company. Peter Tunler is in Colin MacDonald's company, and he too is in good health. Send my kind compliments to his mother and father. When I first came to America, I heard of William McFarlane, but I hear no more often. There is no more at present to add, but that all our countrymen are well and in good health." End quote. Britain lost the war, of course, but the priorities for the likes of that piper were seriously met, and should make us rethink what it all means. How then do questions of motor and identity be best understood in the age of the creation of the Highland Regiments? A useful starting point to remember is that with units like the Black Watch having existed for what will soon be 300 years, it's easy to think of them as very permanent institutions. The permanency of the regiment seems obvious to us now, but that was probably not how the regiments appeared to those contemplating enlistment in the middle to later decades of the 18th century. Regiments came and went with a rapidity that puts even today's government's constant tinkering around with the army to shame. This directly affected how people thought about soldiering. For those willing to commit to a lifelong army career, serving upwards of 25 years, enlistment in a permanent regiment like the Black Watch would offer security, a new sense of deeply ingrained loyalties and professional identity. For others, the majority in fact, military service was more of a sojourn, a decidedly limited career option designed to facilitate substantial financial and economic upward mobility through the acquisition of regular salary, bounty, and of course land either in Scotland or North America. Now, viewed in this way, the remarkable battlefield performances of Highland regiments in this period in a sense becomes even more pronounced. These units were filled with men who were neither Stuart of Garth's erstwhile clansmen, dedicated and naturally inclined to warfare, nor were they coerced constants. Instead, the Highland regiments were formed of men who understood, often in a cool, very calculating way, the real benefits of what military service offered, and who saw the army as a relatively short-term measure. That the Black Watch and its various successors nonetheless still very quickly gathered a huge and widely deserved reputation as superb military units while containing such men tells us something about the brilliant sophistication of the Highland regimental system as it emerged at the middle and end of the 18th century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you so much. I think the nugget that I'll enjoy taking out of that is that we like to sometimes refer to ourselves as the Premier Highland Regiment, which of course we like to think means first and best. But that not only were we the oldest, the first Highland Regiment, that we did survive that long, and it was fantastic to hear some of the why of that as well. One thing that we should talk about Glasgow Green, we have a fantastic interactive of that, and I've done a lot more research on it.
Oh, right. Oh, wow.
And we actually think that it might be 1756, a company sent out to bolster the 1st Battalion,
oh, right.
and this is then in the early period when they were actually being inspected. And I can point out the inspecting crew in the background in their ridiculous outfits and wigs who are standing there going, yes, in fact, these men are, it's these chaps here, we think, are the generals and things, making sure.
And you think this is additional companies being sent out to reinforce?
Yeah, and we think that he is, I think we might know his name, that he's there inspecting them, making sure that they're all behaving properly.
This is
and this is Campbell of Bordeaux over here, who then goes out and manages to get himself.
Well, in that case, that's even more likely to be the men that Macintosh is recruiting.
Could I say that Macintosh then sold his commission and didn't go to...
Oh no, he didn't. He's still mooching around Inverness in 1757, 58, keeping away from the action of things to the best way to say. Yes, but well, that's actually more to the... I assumed he continued to do it 57 and 58. Yeah. But,
well, there has been a lot of discussion about it, and it's doubly so. Like it's obviously pre-royal as well, which means that 1756 is more likely. But it is interesting, and because of the museum redevelopment, we've actually done a fantastic interactive on it, with some narration and things, talking about all the different people in it. So I would recommend, if anyone wants to know more about the painting, there is a fantastic interactive in Gallery 3.
It would also explain the number of men, because anyway you look at it, that's not a whole battalion.
Yeah.
Fascinating, but in a sense it just pertains that these men are probably almost certainly will have it, and a guy that Macintosh is persuading into.
Yes, Does anyone else have any questions for Andrew? Yes, Colonel Blair.
I was told recently by someone who's knowledgeable that a substantial number of Irish men joined the Highland Regiment, and indeed a number were given Mac stuck at the top of their name. Have you heard that?
Certainly, up until this point, there are probably no Irish in the regiment. But by about 1760, Scotland is severely drained of men, and captains are not supposed to take Irishmen. So what they will do, and it's very clear they are doing it, is and Ireland has a much bigger population than Scotland at this point, much bigger. They are almost certainly taking Irishmen and whacking on a suitably Scottish sounding name and sending them in. Given a lot of them will speak Irish Gaelic, it's quite easy to do, particularly at the office of a Gaelic speaker, to be able to get them into. That Lord Loudon, we know, once he's back from America, complains of, and given Loudon's career as Commander-in-Chief of North America, he would know about it, and he does say you've got to stop filling Highland regiments, or any regiment with Irishmen, because it's actually against parliamentary legislation to do that. But everybody keeps doing it.
So that did in fact happen?
It did in fact happen, yes, almost certainly. Probably not to the Black Watch till 61, 62.
I'm sure it was the second half.
And it would happen towards the end of the American War as well. But yes, it would.
What about the length of service, do you think?
Well, once certainly there's a second battalion, a lot of even those guys are not probably expecting to continue after the war. But if you're in the company of an elite, one of the elder captains, you're going to expect to stay in. Because
I find a rather sad letter from somebody who'd been the Scots Guard, the third Foot Guards, of which Lord Loudon had been a captain, and he had just been discharged after 41 years
duty.
In 1746. So he had fought at Malplaquet, and he was coming through. He was coming through Inverness, wearing his scarlet uniform and with his fusee and his sword, and he was made prisoners by the Jacobites. Taken by the Jacobites. He was then faced up to Cumberland, and was then accused of having been a Jacobite. And so he wrote to Lord Loudon saying, can you please let me go, and can I have back my fusee and my sword? Now he had been 41 years in the Third Regiment of Foot Guards, and I found this letter just the other day.
Well, it's interesting to see he writes to Loudon, because John Campbell, heir of Loudon, who of course actually comes from is linked, although he's an Ayrshire family, and actually linked into Perthshire family, Perthshire Campbells. Campbells don't have a good reputation around the 45, but he had a hugely deserved reputation for being humane and for accepting a lot of Jacobite surrenders, such that he got on the wrong side of Cumberland. He's the Commander-in-Chief in North America in the early period, and almost certainly that's one of the reasons why a lot of broken Jacobite kindreds are willing to take the army option to go to North America, because they thought this guy's got a track record of being un-Cumberland-like. He actually had a humane, he wasn't a particularly good commander in North America, but he actually is probably partially responsible for getting a lot of Jacobite kindreds, Frasers and various MacDonalds, etc., to go. It's worth a shot. This guy's got a reasonable reputation for being reasonably humane, provided we don't act up. We may get
but was that 41 years unusual, do you think?
That's highly unusual, yeah. I mean, he would be expected to be honourably
Did they get leave? Did they come back? And did they have wives who were
supposed to get furlough? Well, depending on what the regiment does, they should get furlough, i.e. they should get a bit of a break, roughly every 10 years.
And was that
the army was not what it is.
Was there an allocation of wives? I mean, I read somewhere that you were allowed 6 wives a company or something like that.
Yes, I'm not sure about that. I mean, officers were, it was frowned upon for officers to take. I mean, common soldiers would expect to take a certain proportion to do cleaning and everything along those lines. Officers, but depending on the commanding officer, a lot of commanders didn't like wives for officers.
No, I meant for the soldiers.
For the soldiers, yeah, there's an allocation. It's a certain amount per 100 per company. But I can't remember what it is.
And they kind of, if your husband died, you then just...
Oh, you were off the establishment.
You just married the next one.
You would normally sort of take a flexible attitude towards marriage, and I think biding was probably a useful way to think about it, I suspect. But if they went to India, the wives were left. They would not ship them back. They had to either find their own way or people club together.
So they certainly had their wives in North America.
And the wives in North America. It was worth taking wives because you got more land if you could settle with your family.
Good, sorry, yes.
Could you say a little bit more about the connection between the clearances and recruitment? Is it your contention that some landlords might have deliberately cleared parts of their estates in order to provide them with leverage for recruitment? Or
No.
do the two just go parallel, or was it an outcome of clearances that they had men willing to be recruited?
In clearance, well, first of all, clearance is such a long drawn out process. It's taking quite a while to build up, and parts of Highland Perthshire are already being cleared, but not too dramatic a way. It's happening quite slowly over decades. Farms are just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But interestingly, what recruitment arguably does is give landlords pause for thought, because what it's saying is, if you compare the big tenantry to cattle and sheep, the cattle and sheep can look the good option. But what happens if your tenantry suddenly become quite valuable, as McLeod discovers, when actually you can start to use them as effectively an alternative bargaining chip? In other words, what recruitment does is not hasten clearance, it probably slows it down. Landlords are actually going, hold on a minute, there's a reason to continue to think of tenantry probably in the way a chief used to think of them, which is they're valuable, just in a different way.
So they wouldn't say...
And we know that's true, sorry, because people like McLeod see from Port Alban is probably just every time Crown off Cough see offers a regiment. And all of Tayside remains Loch Tayside remains much more populated than probably would otherwise have been the case. It's depopulated now, but it depopulates a lot later than would have been the case, because all through the 90s, half of huge farms are all given over to soldiers' families. So it's slowing it down. But the leverage for the landlord is that tenantry know that they can move towards putting in sheep and cattle, so they've got more of an impetus to give people. That's why it remains such an effective recruiting area for so long, because the leverage is now, if you don't, I can put sheep and cattle on, so give me your son. And if you did, landlords were quite good at actually keeping their promises, and I'm no great fan of the landlords necessarily, but they actually genuinely tended to stick to the promises and give, you saw Idrigal, Newig and Strelitz, they actually did give them land. So it actually slows it down in certain areas.
But the converse of that strange character, Alastair MacDonald, Glengarry, he who had served with, I forget which Highland regiment, in 1806, offered to raise the Highland regiment, and when he got to Glengarry, he discovered that he had cleared all the men off his estate, and yet there weren't enough men to raise the regiment.
He didn't have enough men.
So that was covered by 1808.
1808, yeah. I mean, Glengarry's an early clearer, and he's one of the people that learns the mistake of, oh, I probably should have kept some of these guys. Particularly the big Athol keeps a lot of his tilt populations, probably precisely because he wants men. Argyll, certainly Bordeaux, big, and a lot of the Skye gentry are keeping tenancy when probably, for an extra generation, probably when they would otherwise have probably begun to clear.
Sorry, Mr. Smith, sorry.
Have you looked at the impact of the loss of the heritable jurisdictions on the Highland chiefs, and how they were, if you like, driven towards finding money from other sources because their old ways of raising cash were taken from them?
That's a very good question, and that's probably another reason that they're willing to think of a military career. Because a military career, I mean, interestingly, the pay the pay is not bad, but it's not particularly good for officers, actually, particularly junior officers. But the key thing is, what it does is, because it's regular, you can borrow it. It's the fact that you know you're going to get the pay that actually, it's not the amount, it's the regularity that particularly people like. And I suspect one of the reasons they use that heritable jurisdiction income for law purposes, being able to tax the population that way, that's probably driving more of them into the army too. It's probably particularly driving the old clan gentry class, your Duncan McPhersons of the world, who were less the owners of heritable jurisdictions as the enforcers of heritable jurisdictions, and that group are certainly looking for something to do. And that's a good point. That's probably also another reason why post-clearance culture is prompting a new militarisation of the Highlands. It's just a different militarisation. That's a good point.
One last question from Hugh, and then we'll have tea.
You've mentioned the enlistment bonuses. Was there any regular remittance sent back from the regiments to their families back in the Glens, or did they just drink it as they did in later times?
Given the number of Highland soldiers, there's clearly a lot of drinking going on. In as much as we found there are a number of remittances that we know are coming back from North America from 1756 onwards. But given the number of soldiers there are, you would expect a lot more. So in answer to your question, yes, I think they are. But that reason, I've just finished looking at wills of that 2nd battalion in India. And in India there tends to be many more Irish men, etc., etc. But when you look at the wills, the 2nd battalion of the Black Watch, as it is just before it turns over, interestingly sets up what's effectively a cooperative. There's in 1 year, something like 97% of the wills registered in Calcutta are Black Watch ordinary soldiers. And what they're doing is they're saying, I've got £1, tiny amounts, and they're passing it to their comrades, saying, I've got a wife or I've got a child, I want you to look after them. And the people whose job it is to manage that, interestingly, and that tells us the way they tend to think about the regiment, is not so much the regiment as a unit, but the captains are expected to, and you heard the guy talk about, I'm in Captain Glenn Ewer's company. They tended to think of their company as the functioning unit. And there, the Black Watch soldiers are remarkable. They're basically, as they die off, and they're circulating the money, not home, but they are making sure it's staying within the regiment effectively in a remarkable way, in a way that certainly didn't go down very well with talking to even Ireland. Irishmen are drinking it away. I don't want to nationally stereotype, but at least some Scots were probably drinking, but actually keeping it in-house. And I've not found any other example of any other regiment anywhere setting up effectively almost an insurance system within its own soldiers. It's a remarkable set. That's the year before it becomes the 73rd. So I don't know if that had anything to do with it.